September 7th, 2010, a Chinese fishing captain is arrested near contested islands in the East China Sea. Routine diplomatic irritant. Then, Japanese electronics executives start getting the same call from their supply chain managers. Rare earth shipments are being held at Chinese customs. No official explanation, no policy announcement, just held. Japan was sourcing nearly 90% of its rare earth supply from China. The prices of those materials would increase roughly tenfold over the following year, according to the World Economic Forum. The Japanese government committed 100 billion yen, about $1.2 billion at 2010 exchange rates, into supply chain alternatives in a single month. Automakers, defense contractors, electronics manufacturers, everyone suddenly running the same calculation at the same time. China never officially confirmed an embargo. Researchers later disputed whether it was even a deliberate national policy or just aggressive enforcement of existing export quotas. But the lesson landed regardless. Whoever controls the supply of critical materials controls the conversation. This is the story of how one country spent 30 decades building that position, methodically, patiently, and largely in plain sight. It runs through your car's electric motor, your country's defense contracts, and the factory town that's been emptying out since 2003. Today, we trace exactly how it was constructed, when the warnings appeared, and what it costs to respond now rather than then.
Go back to December 11, 2001. Geneva, China formally joins the World Trade Organization. President Bill Clinton had championed a deal, calling it, on the record, a win-win result for both countries. The logic was clean. Expose China to market competition, integrated into rules-based trade, watch liberalization follow. Two people in Beijing read that contract differently. Premier Zhu Rongji, who personally negotiated China's WTO entry, understood that access to global markets, combined with state-managed currency rates and massive industrial capacity, meant China could scale manufacturing faster than any developing economy ever had. And the strategic framework inherited from Deng Xiaoping had always operated on a longer time horizon than any Western election cycle. The two institutional actors that mattered most weren't in Geneva. China Northern Rare Earth Group and what would become China Rare Earth Group, the state-owned enterprises Beijing was quietly consolidating into a global monopoly over critical materials. By 2002, the Mountain Pass mine in San Bernardino County, California, once the world's largest rare earth producer, had shut down, priced out by Chinese state-subsidized competition. The U.S. Geological Survey tracked the growing dependency throughout the 2000s. No policy response followed. Meanwhile, the IMF and U.S. Treasury's own reports flagged evidence that China was holding the yuan artificially low against the dollar, a de facto subsidy on every Chinese export. The concern was documented in annual publications. Nothing changed. The first crack was visible. Nobody called it structural. But here's where the story quietly starts to break. December 11, 2001, Geneva. 142 member countries vote China into the global trading system. Within months, U.S. customs data shows Chinese imports accelerating. A landmark 2013 paper by economists David Arthur, David Dorn, and Gordon Hansen attributed roughly 982,000 U.S. manufacturing jobs lost between 2000 and 2007 to Chinese import competition. Approximately 55% of all manufacturing jobs lost in that period. The Economic Policy Institute estimates 3.7 million total U.S. job displacements by 2018. The methodology is contested, but Census Bureau data confirms more than 60,000 U.S. manufacturing establishments closed in the 2 decades following China's WTO entry. Textile towns in the Carolinas, furniture manufacturing in Virginia, home electronics in California, whole industrial ecosystems hollowed out. The macro recovered,
The towns generally didn't. That asymmetry matters for what comes next. Here's what nobody was saying out loud while the trade statistics were being debated. China was simultaneously eliminating competition in the raw materials that all manufacturing depends on. The Mountain Pass mine in California ceased major operations in 2002. Its parent company couldn't match Chinese prices because Chinese prices were supported by state subsidies, looser environmental enforcement, and a deliberate strategic decision to make the global market unworkable for competitors. By the late 2000s, China controlled approximately 90% of global rare earth supply. Rare earth elements sit inside every electric motor, every wind turbine generator, every precision weapons guidance system. The price of building that monopoly, from China's perspective, was essentially zero. Western governments had looked at the commodity prices and concluded the sector wasn't strategic. That conclusion was wrong. September 7, 2010, the arrest. What followed is genuinely disputed by academic researchers. CEPR's analysis of Japanese port data found no uniform halt in imports, and China denied any official embargo. What is not disputed is the outcome. Rare earth prices increased roughly tenfold in the year following the incident, per the World Economic Forum. Japan, 90% dependent on Chinese supply, allocated $1.2 billion to supply chain diversification in 1 month. The government described it as an RE shock, comparable to the 1970s oil crisis. Whether Beijing executed a deliberate geopolitical play or whether Chinese customs officials acted with informal enthusiasm during a diplomatic standoff, the market effect was identical. The world understood that rare earth supply was a lever. One country held it. This is the moment the crack became a fault line. Pause here for a second. If you're starting to recognize this pattern from somewhere else, you're already ahead of where this story ends. Stay with me. September 2013, Xi Jinping announces the Belt and Road Initiative in Kazakhstan. The pitch? Infrastructure investment for the developing world. The mechanism? Chinese state bank loans. Between 2014 and 2017, China's peak lending years, loans exceeding $120 billion backed highways, ports, and power plants across 3 continents, per the Council on Foreign Relations. Aid data, which built the most comprehensive public data set of Chinese overseas finance, tracked 13,427 projects worth $843 billion across 165 countries between 2000 and 2017. China spent roughly $85 billion per year on overseas development, more than double the United States' $37 billion. But the terms differed. A typical Chinese BRI loan carried a 4.2% interest rate with a repayment window under 10 years. A comparable OECD loan from Germany or Japan, 1.1% interest, 28 years to repay. That gap is not generosity. It is dependency arithmetic.
July 29, 2017. Colombo, Sri Lanka. The Sri Lanka Ports Authority and China Merchants Port Holdings, a subsidiary of a Chinese state-owned enterprise, signed a 99-year concession agreement for Hambantota Port, located along one of the world's busiest maritime shipping lanes. China merchants paid $1.12 billion and acquired approximately 70% of operating rights. Sri Lanka's debt to China stood at roughly $8.1 billion out of $64.9 billion in total national debt in 2016, per Kaisen Global. Analysts at The Diplomat have documented carefully that this was not a clean debt-for-equity swap. The original construction loans remain outstanding, and Sri Lankan domestic political decisions drove much of the outcome. But a strategically positioned deep-water Indian Ocean port is now operated by a Chinese state company until 2116. CSIS summarized it: game of loans. Whether the mechanism was deliberate debt trap architecture or the predictable result of bad lending into political dysfunction, the outcome is the same.
Let's run the math on the escalation timeline. December 21, 2023, China bans export of rare earth extraction and separation technology, the processing knowledge that transforms mined ore into usable materials, extending leverage beyond the minerals themselves to the expertise required to produce them anywhere. August 2024. Export restrictions on antimony, used in ammunition, infrared sensors, and flame retardants. Chinese antimony exports fell roughly 97%. Global prices roughly tripled. December 3, 2024. China issues a directive banning exports of gallium, germanium, and antimony to the United States. Gallium and germanium are essential inputs for semiconductor manufacturing, radar systems, and fiber optic infrastructure. Each escalation built the legal and institutional architecture for the next one. China's 2021 export control law providing the statutory foundation, successive mineral controls converting upstream resource dominance into precisely targeted choke points.
April 4, 2025, one day after the Trump administration's Liberation Day tariff announcement. China's Ministry of Commerce places 7 medium and heavy rare earth elements, including terbium, dysprosium, and gadolinium, on an export control list requiring case-by-case licensing approval. October 9, 2025. Sweeping new controls extend to any product containing more than 0.1% rare earth content manufactured in China, along with the equipment and technologies used to produce rare earth materials globally. The IEA documented that China controls approximately 91% of global rare earth refining as of 2024. The U.S. sourced 70% of its rare earth compound and metal imports from China between 2020 and 2023, per the U.S. Geological Survey. The F-35, the Tomahawk, the Virginia-class submarine all depend on supply chains that now run through a licensing desk in Beijing. So does every EV drivetrain sold in North America or Europe.
The breaking point wasn't dramatic. It was a calculation. In April 2025, American defense contractors auditing their rare earth exposure found there was no viable near-term alternative for the processed materials and high-performance magnets their systems require. Rebuilding rare earth processing capacity outside China, the vertical integration spanning mining, separation, alloying, and magnet fabrication takes approximately a decade and billions of dollars, even with full government commitment. The international response confirmed the scale of the problem. Canada committed 3.8 billion Canadian dollars through its 2022 critical minerals strategy. Australia announced a $780 million critical minerals reserve. Japan pledged $120 million toward a single French rare earth refining project. The U.S. One Big Beautiful Bill Act provided $7 billion for critical minerals production through 2029. The IEA projected that China will still control approximately 78% of rare earth refining in 2040, even if every current Western diversification plan succeeds on schedule. That $7 billion figure, for context, the American Defense Department's annual budget is approximately $886 billion. The investment in materials that defense systems depend on represents less than 1% of that. The gap between strategic dependency and strategic investment is not a secret. It's a documented, publicly available number. It just wasn't politically urgent until it was. Meanwhile, the Financial Times recorded in November 2025 that BRI borrowers from Indonesia to Kenya were struggling to service loan payments, with China's outstanding overseas development debt exceeding $1 trillion. The leverage runs in multiple directions, but the asymmetry in critical minerals is structurally different, because the West cannot build its way to parity in rare earth processing by next quarter, or next year, or likely by 2030.
Now, before you file this under ancient history, two mechanisms are running in parallel right now, in sectors that directly affect anyone reading a pension statement or setting energy policy. First, battery supply chains. As of late 2025, China controls 80% or more of midstream and downstream lithium-ion battery production infrastructure, per the IEA. Beijing's October 2025 controls extended to battery cells, cathode materials, and manufacturing equipment. Every EV mandate in the US, UK, and Canada implicitly assumes access to this supply chain without significant disruption. Second, BRI debt concentration.
Aid data documented that roughly 80% of BRI government loans to developing countries went to nations already in debt distress. When those countries restructure, as Sri Lanka formally did in April 2022, Chinese state institutions become primary creditors in negotiations that determine infrastructure rights and resource extraction terms for decades. That's not predatory lending per se, it's leverage that compounds. One signal worth watching: the IEA's annual Global Critical Minerals Outlook publishes the most reliable gap analysis between Western diversification investment and actual processing capacity. The numbers move slowly, but they move. This isn't a history lesson, it's a pattern recognition exercise.
The WTO's rules were designed for market economies. They contained no enforceable mechanisms for state subsidies, currency management, or the strategic consolidation of critical resource supply chains. China operated within those rules while running a parallel state industrial policy that no rule prohibited. The structural flaw wasn't bad faith. It was an architecture designed for one type of economy being applied to a fundamentally different one. The mismatch was documented. It was not acted upon. Institutional scope insensitivity. Every company and government that deepened its dependency on Chinese rare earth processing and Chinese BRI financing did so because each individual decision was economically rational. Cheaper inputs, faster infrastructure, lower borrowing costs. No single decision-maker was responsible for the aggregate picture. The cognitive failure is the systematic inability to sum individually small risks into their true collective exposure. A pattern behavioral economists have documented in financial markets, and one that appears with equal regularity in geopolitical supply chain policy. Map your exposure. If you run a business with manufacturing inputs, manage money with industrial or defense sector exposure, or vote for people who make industrial policy, the IEA Critical Minerals Outlook and Aid Data's project-level datasets are public and readable. The gap between the supply chain diversification timeline those reports describe and the timelines governments are actually funding is a real number. It is knowable. It is not being prominently communicated. That gap between what institutions know and what they act on is the most consistent feature of every story in this series.
Here is the question this story cannot answer cleanly. Was this a deliberate 30-year strategy or a competitive advantage that Beijing learned mid-game it could weaponize? Those two interpretations have very different implications. Opportunism has one remedy, strategy has another. The evidence supports elements of both, which is precisely why the policy response has been so slow and so expensive. But here's what the data does answer. The dependency was visible, documented, and unaddressed for 2 decades. That's not a China problem. That's a decision-making problem. And it's not unique to rare earths. Was Xi Jinping running a long game, or did the West simply hand him the pieces and call it free trade? Make your case in the comments. I'll engage with the strongest arguments on both sides. The ones that change my thinking get a pinned reply. Now, if this story felt familiar, that's because it should. There's another country that spent decades inside one of the most powerful economic cartels in history, quietly accumulated leverage nobody saw coming, then walked away from the table entirely, on its own terms, at a moment of its own choosing. That country is the UAE, and the real reason it left OPEC has almost nothing to do with oil prices. If that's the kind of forensic breakdown you're here for, it's already waiting for you.